here. So we have 3 more presentations scheduled for the session. First is Kira Boyden from the University of Kent, then Jamie Towser from Birmingham City University, and then Stefan Krixty from University of Toronto. Each speaker will have 15 minutes for the presentation, and I will be holding up a note card to let you know when you have 5 or 1 minute left. If you are sharing your screen, because you won't be able to really see the card, I will be just extremely shortly interrupting you to let you know. Following the last presentation, Nigel Rapport, who is the Professor of Anthropological and Philosophical Studies at the University of St. Andrews, will be providing commentary for all 7 papers of the panel and questions for each speaker individually. So all questions from the audience will be addressed towards the end of the session. So please put your questions in the chat, and I will be monitoring the chat as we move on. And please also let us know whether you're having a question for a particular speaker or whether this is for the whole session or for the whole panel, so for both sessions. So without further ado, we will be starting with Kira Boyden, who is a PhD candidate in social anthropology at the University of Kent, and who will be presenting her paper, A Healing Politics and the Politics of Healing, How Mental Health Activists Care Otherwise. Kira, the screen is yours.
Okay, here we go. Let's see. Let's see if I can make the impossible happen. Is that working?
Yes, you did.
Yes. Okay, awesome. Okay, so thanks for having me. My research explores the everyday philosophies and practices of care among 3 groups of mental health activists in London. I draw from phenomenological approaches such as Zygon's conceptualization of disclosive freedom to examine activists' collective responses to mental distress and other ways to well-being. This research is based on 13 months of ethnographic fieldwork, which began in 2018. So I'm going to begin today by contextualizing mental health activism in London, and it will suggest why certain aspects of care are so important for interlocutors. I'll explore the particular qualities of activist spaces and examine how activists aim to care otherwise. Understanding approaches to mental health in the UK today cannot be divorced from its context of austerity, Brexit, the chronic underfunding of the NHS, as well as the controversy around spending in mental health services, combined with concurrent discourses around mental health epidemics. Mental health services are currently under further pressure due to the impact of the pandemic. And in this environment, many interlocutors are required to engage in welfare regimes and are subject to methods of surveillance in order to receive benefits, payments which depend on being a recipient of NHS services. Many of those involved in service evading groups share a dream that another mental health care is possible and necessary. Most individuals have experiences of treatment as usual, which has been, in their own words, iatrogenic, so that is harmful. In these contexts, receiving standardized NHS treatments for severe or enduring distress made the recipient feel worse and often took them on a path to explore alternatives, some through activism. For many activists, especially those who've experienced forced treatment such as drugging or involuntary hospitalization, their individual journeys have involved refinding their voices, identities, and community. Feeling tainted or ostracized from experiences both before and during treatment, they come together to repair, in the words of Mattingly. Let's see, just trying to go and do my next slide. So service evaders challenge the conception of mental illness as an individual pathology or vulnerability and reject the biomedical model. The term mental illness is deemed inaccurate in activist circles, and distress is used instead to refer to a broad range of mental experiences. It's a conscious turn away from understanding distress as a biological-based disease towards something more everyday, socially oriented and embedded. Many activists opt out of the pharmacological world, avoiding medical or clinical treatments, or indeed any form of statutory or third sector services. One of activists' arguments is that mental health professionals increasingly work within market value frameworks, replete with targets and efficiency measures which affect the ways they conduct treatments. In this environment, service evaders argue that services cannot offer the diversity, consistency, and complexity of support they seek. Activists choose instead to support one another, maintaining that well-being is best secured through collective, mutual, and non-clinical methods. Such methods include forming campaign and discussion groups, focusing on the social causes and ameliorations of distress, experimenting with therapeutic rituals, and being alongside one another in a crisis. Mental health activists are a diverse group of people. The network in London is made up of small but interconnected grassroots groups who see themselves as part of a larger movement. Groups comprise former psychiatric patients and other ex-mental health service users, service survivors, and service evaders who tend to meet and support one another at events such as demonstrations or in public letters. During fieldwork, I followed a number of individuals who moved between groups and spaces in London. I conducted participant observation at group meetings, in conferences, on protests, as well as in cafes, pubs, libraries, GP centres, and interlocutors' homes. Service evader group meetings are usually held in local areas. Each group has its own identity, its own specific ways of working, rules, and culture, and importantly, they tend to have their own specific campaign issues. For example, one of the main groups I work with campaigned for the abolition of practices of forced restraint in hospital wards, and another for an end to workfare, whereby individuals in distress undertake work in return for benefits payments. The otherwise is a term borrowed from recent anthropological work on social movements with prefigurations of care at their core, and attends to the ways in which actors in these contexts build alternative worlds and experiences within certain restrictive environments. Specifically, living the otherwise is about being in situations when one might not able to currently live the change that they wish to see in society, but rather act as a reimagining and reconfiguring the conditions they currently live in. It's a necessary part of creating different possibilities for living. Caring otherwise for mental health activists is central to politics and the maintenance of daily needs, and relations involve an affective dimension that they perceive to be missing in clinical approaches. Care is about growing a biomedically free community as much as it is about support or healing. It's about how people relate, socialize, and identify with one another. Ooh. Individual actors involved in activist networks tend to cultivate a kind of unconditional acceptance and tolerance of one another, particularly in regards to beliefs around mental distress, as well as things they've done or ways they've behaved, often during periods of distress, which may challenge how they feel about themselves. One way in which they do this is by meeting regularly in parks, cafes, social centres, and hubs to talk. With the places where therapeutic events occur, in fact, often quite the opposite, interlocutors create a habit. Activist networks and activities span multiple locations. Practices of care and being with are carried across diverse locations throughout London, and networks such that now to explore a specific act of placemaking, creating disorderly spaces, ways of non-organizing and rejecting group meetings. Therapeutic placemaking in this context involves creating an anti-didactic environment where one is free to be oneself, yet is contained by the collective and partly constituted by care. A key aspect of placemaking for activists constitutes environments in which they can express themselves without fear or judgment, unlike other places. This includes talking with, perhaps expressing those physical movements which many try to hide in public, such as pacing up and down, which are often side effects of antipsychotic medication. One thing I noticed very early on in fieldwork was the significant flexibility regarding the presence and commitment of interlocutors at meetings and other events, such as public seminars or protests. People tend to move freely between events and groups, falling out, making up, leaving, and coming back together again. One of the most striking aspects of the flexibility is that arguments and fights are given space in a way that seems incredibly forgiving, yet at first seemed counterproductive from my point of view. In field notes about one meeting, I noted that they had a strange, wandering quality to them. Members don't seem to agree on what they're going to say or do. People talk haphazardly, interrupting one another, changing the conversation without pauses or reflection. Interlocutors often travel far and took great efforts to attend particular meetings that they would want meetings to be efficient, focused, and productive in order to feel worth their while. However, this was not the case. Meetings are conducted without formalities such as agendas or minutes. Anyone can drop into meetings, meaning it's impossible to know who might turn up. There are rarely any introductions. It's up to the individual to introduce herself. Conversations are reactive and dynamic, responsive to personal stories or news items, and topics of discussion are entirely changeable. Official leadership or facilitation in meetings is rare. Meetups are typically led by whoever wants to speak at any point in time. There are no formal written rules or anticipated ways of organising, including no expectations of turn taking. For example, at one meeting, one woman walked in from the street seeking shelter from the cold, and at another young woman came in just to eat a piece of cake to celebrate her discharge from hospital. It's important to note at this point that interlocutors sometimes expressed frustration or made jokes about the lack of structure. It was not always considered to be a wholly positive thing to have no beginning or end, as one member put it. Another member joked, but is there even a middle? Arguments could last for hours without someone to intervene, and there are many fallouts and breakdowns. Over time, I came to understand the way that the service evader groups organise reflects an ambivalent relationship to bureaucratic working. This in part involves a conscious construction of a meeting space which is entirely other from places such as the clinic or hospital. Therapeutic placemaking, 5 minutes, thank you. Therapeutic placemaking involves, where am I? I lost my space. Basically, through certain ways of being in place, interlocutors reject processes and relations they associate with expertise and authority and routinized intimacy. Presence is considered a therapeutic quality. Being with one another in this context is about not having expectations for anyone to work through, change, or fix anything about themselves. As one member said, it doesn't matter what we do, it's just being. Hopefully I can present this vignette quickly, as I want to discuss it as an important part of being with. The active listening among activists is a conscious political and therapeutic strategy. It's born out of a desire to express personal stories without judgment and is part of an ethics of immediacy, in the words of Zygon, a kind of attunement towards others' needs in the moment. As I mentioned, group meetings are important locations where it's almost guaranteed that one will engage in collective listening. Interlocutors discuss stories of families and relationships, and it's not necessarily what is being said that's important, but that it is listened to and how. So in a weekly meeting run by Campaign Against Mental Illness, there are 11 of us, and the meeting had not begun so well. 2 members had ended up in a heated argument about the best way to wean off psychotropic medication, when suddenly out of the blue, Claire begins speaking. As she speaks, something strikes me. It's not particularly her story I find interesting, the atmosphere in the room. At first, I think that members are just glad for a distraction. They become alert and shift in their chairs, as though at this point they understand the meeting is truly properly beginning. People sit up, glazed looks lifting, and settle to listen. As Claire speaks, her voice and words fill up the small community hall where we're sat. I've been diagnosed and misdiagnosed with many things, but they've settled with schizophrenia, she begins. She talks for a long time about how she suspects that her so-called schizophrenia came from fly larvae, which was laid under her skin in 1983. She's certain that the larva crawled into her one night while she was asleep. She gives a long and detailed account of exactly how the larva may have hatched and crawled into her body, which nerves they may have damaged, how they may have affected her, and the side effects she thinks that they have caused. She tells us that over time, GPs have stopped listening to her. She went to get an X-ray after telling doctors of the pain in her head. During the appointment, she saw a squiggly line on the X-ray, which she perceived to be the worm. After she pointed it out, the doctor gave her a different copy of an X-ray without the line on it. She told us that this was actually just an entirely different X-ray, and it wasn't even her head. The doctor must have hidden the original one. Claire tells us that the majority of my mental health problems are because I couldn't speak when I needed to. Someone else murmurs that indeed being listened to makes us feel more human. Claire tells us how she was trained as a nurse and has published numerous times in well-known medical journals. I'm a scientist, she explains. Medical professionals know we're not thick and we've got degrees. She looks around us carefully as she suggests that perhaps mental health professionals stop listening because they know her truth is true, but they don't want to or can't acknowledge it. When Claire finishes speaking, there's a silence in the room. People nod and murmur disapprovingly. There are a couple of sympathetic tuts. I wait for somebody to question or challenge her story, but I quickly realize that no one is going to. As I come to realize over time, thank you, this is part of an unspoken rule amongst activists that requires the listener to take what people say at face value without interrupting or challenging them. Claire's story is just one among countless others I witnessed being told to a rapt crowd of listeners. There are certain physical aspects to listening, which involve ceasing activity, looking at the speaker, maintaining eye contact, and even holding your body open to invite further storytelling. It's a kind of embodied attunement to the experience of the other. Listening requires and demands persistent attention whilst also allowing for flexibility in individual circumstances, say if somebody is too agitated to listen or needs to leave the room. So finally, embedded in these practices of listening and flexible ways of being is a fundamental stance of what Zygon calls disclosive freedom. He describes in his ethnography of drug users who organize against the global war on drugs, but disclosive freedom is a type of relational inclusivity cultivated amongst drug agonists. For example, when politically inexperienced drug user members integrally shape decision-making. During fieldwork, Zygon was left wondering why groups did not just formulate clear rules around participation for efficiency, yet he reflects that the meetings then were clearings in which freedom is not the property of an individual human being, but rather an attuned atmosphere that emerges through the mutuality of letting each other be. So disclosive freedom there is an openness by which one lets worlds and their inhabitants become what they may, rather than posing a particular way of being onto them. Zygon outlines how there is not an is or an ought in drug agonists' way of being, neither is a linear trajectory desirable or expected. For mental health activists, a similar way of allowing things to happen emerges and is cultivated through relational practices, including listening. Part of cultivating a different politics of healing, I suggest, involves challenging and reworking distress through ways of letting one another be. Caring otherwise in a way that promotes well-being in this context requires being differently in the world. It involves people's ability to adapt, to be open, to practice flexibility, and to make things happen according to what is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Kira, for keeping to the time. So our next speaker is Jamie Towser, who is an early career research fellow with the EU Marie Sklodowska-Curie Actions Innovate Dignity Project and a PhD candidate at the Birmingham City University, the Faculty of Health Education and Life Sciences. She will be speaking about gender experiences of dignity and well-being among older adults in a residential care setting with a focus on the ongoing pandemic. Jamie, the stage is yours.
Oh, thank you. Yes, as you said, my name's Jamie, and I'm happy to be tuning in today from down in Birmingham. And after a week of listening to the results of so many interesting research projects, I feel a bit out of my depth sharing my experience of pre- and interrupted fieldwork. At this point, as I will explain in the following paper, I will not be sharing final findings. However, I'm hoping that the perspective from before going into the field may contribute to our shared discussion on care and responsibility, and that in this particular panel's discussion of well-being as a form of cultural belonging in the current climate of the pandemic. Okay, so in consideration of the theme for this panel, I would like to offer my perspective as an early career researcher who is currently navigating access to the field, a residential care home, which is a high-risk area during the COVID pandemic, to evaluate and question pandemic-era discussion on the future of old age community care. In grappling with the delays to begin data collection and then the ethics approval process for the study during the COVID-19 pandemic, some new questions and nuanced perspectives have come to the fore, namely issues of consent and rights to participate in research during a time when these settings are protected and bounded, but also, and perhaps equally, at times outside of a crisis. I will provide a conceptual overview of my proposed research, and will then discuss the current phase of this project and the impacts that the pandemic has had on both my data collection timeline and the framings of what it may mean to be healthy together in residential care. This research project is part of the Marie Curie Innovate Dignity Fellowship, which is an early career training program for caring science scholars who will engage with experiential aspects of well-being and care for older persons through qualitative research. The collective project is designed to promote and deepen a life world-led approach to care, which is a perspective in the caring sciences underpinned by phenomenological and existential philosophies of the self and experience of personhood. Theories of life world-led care draw from Husserl's notion of the life world, the world of lived experience inhabited by individuals, and his exploration of the basic dimensions of lived experience, such as temporality, spatiality, and embodiment. Furthermore, Heidegger's contemplations on selfhood, including being with others, and Merleau-Ponty's body object and body subject, all contribute to existing understandings of life world-led care. Framing well-being as an existential concept helps us to address issues that may often plague analyses of healthcare provision and public health research, namely viewing health as the mere opposite of illness. Applying a humanization framework helps us to understand how one's experiences of care may be either humanizing or dehumanizing in the context of care provision. Currently, the values that underpin humanization literature are often missing from gerontological and sociological research on aging, though there is a copious amount of research on older adults. Research on older adults often promotes homogenizing stereotypes and can fail to consider the intersecting identities that follow us throughout the life course. A humanized perspective on gender and aging will help to engage with the complex, nuanced aspects of the individual and thus help to promote research which centers older adults' experiences and perceptions. I began this project in January of 2020, just weeks before the pandemic outbreak spread to public awareness in England. I had originally planned to begin my research project in the spring of 2020. I watched the numbers grow, the highlighting of those most vulnerable, holding my breath as I read about the horrific stories of COVID spreading like wildfire through residential care homes. The following months were spent in a postgraduate certification course, mapping a proposal for a project that no longer seemed doable. However, in the face of uncertainty, I persisted in my design. I will use ethnographic field methods to explore the culture of a residential care facility located in North England to ask how gender shapes the ways individuals experience relationships in the context of a residential care facility. There are many experiences that may promote or deny dignity and well-being in care. This project will highlight just a few. Specifically, I'll focus on personal relationships and intimacy, and I'll explore the ways in which gender shapes the experiences of socialization among residents of this facility. The setting is a residential care community for older adults, which is designed as a series of individual households, each with 10 to 12 residents in separate apartments. I will reside in a separate guest apartment in the community over the duration of the data collection period. I will conduct ethnographic research to understand the day-to-day experiences of residents with and without cognitive impairments through the means of participant observation, interviews, and conversations with both residents and staff. With the support of gatekeepers for the households, managers, and residential care staff, I will introduce my research to the community and to each household, and I will conduct participant observation during household-wide events, such as cooking, crafting, and activities of daily life. I will conduct participant observation for no more than 4 hours at a time in order to respect residents' and staff's needs for privacy and rest. Data will take the form of field notes from participant observation, as well as recorded and transcribed interviews and conversations. Additionally, I will keep a journal, which I've already started, to document my experience and impressions as I walk the line between outsider and insider of this community, and in order to maintain a narration of my positionality in the data collection and analyses phases. The interview questions do not ask explicitly about gender, but instead invite participants to describe their social landscape and to elaborate on what matters for them. This is to support and to gain better insight on the priorities of the participants themselves. Data analysis will focus on the way gender informs and shapes social relationships in the community, and I will analyze data guided by a critical gender theory framework in order to understand gender in context. In order to analyze the gendered experiences that inform residents' navigation of and inclusion within this community, Raewyn Connell's 3 pillars of gender analysis, division of power, division of labor, and catexis provide a useful framework. Connell argues that these pillars cannot be analyzed separately, and while this project focuses primarily on interpersonal relationships, it is possible to examine gender without considering labor and power influences. In Connell's framework, catexis is used specifically to describe the dynamic of social interactions, and while Connell mainly uses the concept of catexis to discuss sexual relationships, here it will be used in a broader sense to discuss any meaningful relationship from the participants' perspectives. Data analysis will also be guided by a humanization of care framework in order to connect my findings to issues of dignity and well-being in care settings. This framework helps us to understand wellness and care along several inextricably interwoven and not separate dimensions of human experience, which aids in a complex and context-based understanding of existential concepts such as well-being and dignity. I aim to understand the lives, experiences, and the world as lived by these residents through an interpretivist epistemology that draws upon intersubjectivity, intersubjectivity, and hermeneutics as a theory of interpretation. The investigation of gendered impacts on residents' experiences of well-being and dignity in a residential care facility is a layered analysis which extends from the lived experience of the individual out to the institutional and sociocultural contexts and back to the individual experience and perceptions. Taking a relational approach to gender will be useful in understanding individuals' experiences within an institutional matrix and within a larger sociocultural and historical context. So that's the conceptual overview, but of course, I've been a bit locked out of collecting data, and it's impossible to consider the logistics of this research project without taking the pandemic and its impacts into consideration. The timeline for data collection has already been altered from its original timeframe. I have maintained contact with both the CEO of the residential care home as well as the manager for the specific campus at which I plan to reside and collect data. I've received HRA, university, and fellowship ethics approval. I will visit the home later this month for a week to meet staff and residents, distribute recruitment materials, and to evaluate how to build a schedule for data collection. Though we're aiming for spring and summer data collection, the timeframe for my work is not yet set. With the uncertainties of COVID, we must remain flexible. Aside from the logistical aspects of affecting data collection timeline, there are of course ethical concerns to consider. My field site is a residential care home for older people. I will be working with a very high-risk population. I will be working in people's homes during a crisis which disproportionately impacts older adults. I will be speaking with people who have not been able to see their families, to move around as they normally would, who've been at the risk of grave illness or death. It will be important to find a way to do embedded research in this community that ensures the safety and comfort of participants, staff, and myself. Furthermore, it will be important to be mindful of the emotional impact that my being there may have on residents and staff. I will be entering a community which has experienced loss of community members, potential loss of loved ones, prolonged isolation, and confusing restrictions and enhanced and ever-changing regulation. It is quite likely that my presence may be at times disruptive or disorienting for some. Considering this risk, it is also hopefully quite possible that my presence may provide additional companionship, support, and a chance to share one's experiences and perspectives with a wider audience. This project is designed to engage the experiences and perceptions of residents themselves, focusing on personal relationships and intimacy and exploring the ways in which socialization is a navigated negotiation between actors within the context of residential care. The study nuances the notion of dignity and well-being in the residential care setting, looking at the co-constructions that produce and complicate residents' experiences of care. This is now a research project on COVID in many ways, and the questions of dignity and well-being in community care remain and are more complicated now than ever before. The justification for this research project was there before COVID. In times of crisis, such as the current COVID-19 pandemic, research remains vital as we adapt to the changing needs of older adult care recipients. However, paternalistic attitudes towards older adults is well documented as a contributing cultural value that shapes the way we approach research with, or more often on, this population. Age-based discrimination has been documented to impact healthcare research. Studies often have an unjustified upper age limit, which means that research is not documenting the realities for older adults. Findings from this study will, again, hopefully contribute to research on how to improve residential care based on what residents do and what they say about their lives in this space. Including all willing voices will provide better insight to the priorities and perspectives of this population. COVID brings new challenges to being there to interview and to observe during the daily lives of residents. The pandemic has led to an increase in paternalistic attitudes towards the elderly and has set new and firm limits to interactions with friends and family, which brings to light challenging ethical issues related to both dignity and well-being for older adults in residential care. The residential care facility has seen and will continue to see many changes due to COVID. And with an ethnographic methodology, this project can reflect these changes in real time and gain insight on the particular challenges and needs of the residential care environment. This may be further understood by Ursula Rao's care control complex. Care also implies some form of control. The lockdown in these residential settings may have highlighted certain paternalistic phenomena and power dynamics that were already there, but they've become highlighted through the regulations of the pandemic. And I think following through, I'll be hopefully documenting as these regulations are dismantled and we can follow some of these power lines after the lockdowns. And this is an interesting tension or juncture that needs to be further explored. Finally, it is a privilege to talk to people about their lives, to participate and observe in a community, and to gain the trust of people who provide insight on what matters to them. When done well, research can glean new and useful information that can be used to improve services and to create change. And it can also result in building new relationships, understandings, and connections. At this point, it is clear that the adjustments specific to the pandemic will shape this research project. Again, this is a strength of ethnographic research. Being transparent about my positionality throughout the planning, design, collection, and analysis stage will help to account for the changes in data that have occurred. I'm an early career researcher who has been barred from the field during this pandemic year. I have no doubt that this experience will shape and inform the final write-up of my findings. And I look forward to returning to conferences like this to share my findings in a few years. Thank you.
That was perfect timing, by the way, and thank you so much for sharing such a self-reflective account of what it means to do fieldwork during a pandemic. I think we all can relate to an extent. So last but not least is Stefan Crixey, who is a PhD candidate in English at the University of Toronto. And he will be speaking about well-led planning, public health preparation, and scenarios of community wellness. And he will be also focusing on pandemic scenarios. Stefan, we're looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm just going to try and upload my slides right now. Hopefully everyone can see them. So in the fall of 2019, a pandemic emergency board was convened in response to an emerging public health threat of global concern, a novel coronavirus. Confirmed cases of a new disease dubbed coronavirus-associated pulmonary syndrome, or CAPS, had been reported across the globe. The emergency board soon discovered that CAPS was both highly contagious and extremely virulent. They also discovered, to their dismay, that a pandemic was inevitable. 18 months later, when the CAPS pandemic had ended, 65 million people had died. The CAPS pandemic, of course, was fiction, although extremely plausible and eerily prescient fiction. This fictional pandemic served as the plotline for ASA2021, a fictional outbreak scenario jointly organized by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and the World Economic Forum. As a narrative technology of uncertainty management and contingency planning, scenario exercises tell plausible stories of possible futures to prepare for low-frequency, high-impact possibilities, such as, for instance, a global pandemic. In the case of Event 201, scenario participants who served as players of the Pandemic Emergency Board or on the Pandemic Emergency Board were tasked with, quote, confronting difficult, true-to-life dilemmas associated with responses to a hypothetical but scientifically plausible pandemic. These players, 15 in total, concluded that the world was not prepared for a global pandemic and issued a series of policy recommendations that I'll touch on a little bit later in this paper. Unsurprisingly, almost immediately after the WHO characterized COVID-19 as a pandemic on March 11th, 2020, Event 201 began to attract significant media attention. Pointing to the similarities between COVID-19 and the scenario exercise, some commentators suggested that whatever our failures to prepare for COVID-19, they were primarily failures of preparation rather than failures of imagination. We were, according to some, quote, warned about COVID-19, but we didn't listen. For instance, on March 18th, 2020, The Atlantic published an article simply entitled, "We Were Warned," opening with a fairly catechistic recount of the many warning signs that we ignored. It ended with a discussion of Event 201 that ran, "We were warned in 2019 when the Johns Hopkins Center for Health and Security gathered public health experts, business leaders, and US government officials for simulations of the devastating humanitarian, political, social, and economic consequences of fictional coronaviruses. Similar conclusions have been expressed not only by members of the media, but also leading members of the medical community, such as Jeffrey Sachs, chair of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission. As far as conclusions about COVID-19 go, this is a fairly reassuring one, implying as it does that we have the tools to prepare for the next pandemic, provided we run more outbreak scenarios and take them a little bit more seriously when we do. However, rather than endorsing the conclusion that, quote, "we were warned, but we didn't listen," in this paper, I want to ask who exactly was warned, who exactly failed to listen, and more importantly, who exactly is this, quote, "we" of public health outbreak scenarios. And in doing so, I focus on scenarios as a narrative technology. Notably, public health experts have paid very little attention to the role of narrative and storytelling in shaping scenario outcomes and policy recommendations. Indeed, existing research tends to treat narrative as a sort of neutral medium, a sort of neutral container for content delivery. And there has been very little focus on the role that narrative plays, to quote literary scholar Stanley Fish, in constructing audience expectations, conclusions, judgments, and assumptions. More to the point, there has been virtually no attention to narrative capacity to shape and imagine community, even though, as literary scholar Barbara Eckstein notes, most storytelling, arguably all storytelling, is about community setting commuting boundaries, including some audience members within its territory and excluding others. This boundary setting is inherent in the contract between narrators and audiences that all stories inscribe. Carefully told and carefully heard, stories do have the potential to act as a bridge between ingrained habits and new futures, but their ability to act as transformative agents depends upon disciplined scrutiny of their forms and uses. This paper serves as a sort of start towards a more disciplined scrutiny of outbreak scenarios and the ways that they may shape communities, or indeed exclude certain communities. Over the past 2 decades, the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security has produced 4 high-level outbreak scenarios, ranging from Operation Dark Winter in 2003 to Event 201 in 2019. Each one of these scenarios mobilize and represent high-level participants responding to kind of catastrophic disease emergence, smallpox, influenza, or coronavirus. And each one of them only exclusively focuses on sort of what Operation Dark Winter calls accomplished individuals who have served in high-level government or military positions. Although Event 201 made a sort of conscious attempt to increase stakeholder diversity, it did so solely by including high-level representatives from the private sector. Indeed, Event 201 signals a sort of high watermark for CEO and industry representation. Of the total 15 players, 7 were drawn directly from the private sector, and still more had close ties to corporate boards. At the same time, there was no engagement or any representation of community, grassroots, or labor representation. In short, the outbreak scenario, these outbreak scenarios produce a vision of a global we composed solely of high-level professional experts, epidemiologists, officials, C-suite executives who speak on behalf of and to an undifferentiated general public from a global position, at once from nowhere and everywhere. This, despite the fact that, as Cecilia Marston succinctly puts it in the pages of The Lancet, community participation is crucial during a pandemic. I argue that this failure to engage with community representation throughout outbreak scenarios stems from an over-reliance on a formulaic narrative pattern known as the outbreak narrative. First theorized by literary scholar Priscilla Wald in 2007, the outbreak narrative frames the story of disease emergence by focusing primarily on microbes, carriers, and epidemiologists traveling through global networks of transmission and interconnection. By foregrounding microbes, carriers, and epidemiologists in this way as the sort of primary characters in the story of disease emergence, the outbreak narrative suggests that a global pandemic can be resolved primarily, if not entirely, through technocratic and biomedical interventions by high-level experts who are responsible for, but not responsive to, communities. At the same time, the outbreak narrative frames populations as universally and equally susceptible to disease emergence, flattening differences between communities while framing a global population as a sort of, once again, passive medium through which disease spreads. Paradoxically, the outbreak narrative also tends to single out a single community as the source of a disease spread. Frequently, these communities are marginalized in some ways or situated in what is called undeveloped spaces in these narratives. To put it simply, the outbreak narrative dissolves communities into a global population that constitutes a sort of environmental backdrop. We might even say the setting of the story of disease emergence, where communities cannot serve and are not seen as active participants or agents in healthcare initiatives to achieve their own ends. In the time remaining, I'd like to turn to Event 201 itself as a sort of case study to demonstrate the ways in which the outbreak narrative characterizes and shapes outbreak scenarios. And here is this one of the moments where I really wish I had my slides, but we can see the emphasis on an undifferentiated and global population with the Event 201 logo in and of itself, where the globe is presented in this sort of quasi-pointillist fashion without any political or geographic distinctions, produced through a repeating series of points on a map, each one of the same size, shape, and color as another. In the space around this globe, there are yellow dots, presumably representing the microbes as it circles the globe. In this logo, then, the dots simultaneously represent the landscape, the microbes, and the global population. In short, the logo itself conveys the logic of the outbreak narrative, in which communities are dissolved into a global population of sort of universally vulnerable subjects, which simultaneously serve as the backdrop or background or environment of disease spread. What's more, during the exercise itself, much of the information of the CAPS pandemic was delivered to participants in the form of a short pseudo-news clips and media vignettes. The exercise begins with a pan over a shot of a herd of pigs, overlaid then with a graphic of a pig, which is again overlaid with a CGI coronavirus. As a voiceover tells us, it began in healthy-looking pigs, months, perhaps years ago. We then watch a coronavirus microbe travel down the respiratory tract of a pig before circulating in its lungs. Then we have an abrupt shift of focus as the screen shows us the circulation of a woman coughing on an airplane, presumably itself to represent the circulation of the microbe in a carrier traveling through global traffic networks. At the same time, at no point is there any discussion or engagement with the communities of these areas or any others. We have no engagement with particular cities, although there is some discussion of the mega cities in South America as a source of coronavirus, or CAPS, I should say. Instead, community spread is simply taken as a sort of fait accompli. And so from the outset of Event 201, we see an emphatic focus on the characteristic elements of the outbreak narrative. A newly emergent microbe, carriers traveling on a global network against an otherwise passive, undifferentiated background. And the impact of the outbreak narrative is perhaps nowhere more apparent than in the policy recommendations advanced at the end of Event 201. Unsurprisingly, given the narrative focus, virtually all of the policy solutions focused on either epidemiological surveillance, biomedical interventions, or the need to increase public-private partnerships. Throughout these recommendations, there is only one reference made to community as such, in the suggestion that, quote, public health authorities should work with private employers and trusted community leaders to promulgate factual information to employees and citizens. In other words, to the extent that the communities are engaged or considered at all during Event 201, they merely serve as conduits for communicating public health diktats produced through public-private partnerships. And to be clear, it's not my intention here to suggest that the outbreak narrative as such is necessarily inaccurate or wrong. Rather, we might say that the problem with this narrative is that it works entirely too well. It has, as Priscilla Wald notes, an urgency that captures attention. And as Throgmorton argues, such planning stories inevitably, invariably shape the reader's attention, turning it this way rather than that. In the case of public health scenarios, the outbreak narrative directs attention now and in the future towards high-level epidemiological responses and public-private partnerships and away from the possibilities of community engagement. Such narrative, 1 minute? Great. Literary critic Roland Barthes once wrote, there are, quote, thousands of countless forms of narrative in the world. If this is true, the practitioners and producers of outbreak scenarios have apparently not yet realized as much, as they operate as if there is only one narrative of disease emergence, the outbreak narrative. The next step in my research will be focus on alternative models, alternative forms of narratives for the story of disease emergence that centers community. It's also, I think, not enough merely to demand or call for further community representation or even achieve that without addressing the role that the narrative itself plays in constraining the attention of all participants. I want to suggest that we also need to broaden our idea of what counts as the story of disease emergence and disease preparations beyond the formulaic pattern of the outbreak narrative. And I will end it there. And my apologies for the tech issues.
Right on time. Thank you so much. I know we all have tech issues today, so don't take it on you. So thank you actually to all the speakers for these engaging presentations. Now we're very happy to be having with us Professor Nigel Rapport, who will be discussing and drawing common themes from all 7 papers of our panel. So this is from both sessions 1 and 2. In the meantime, can you please ask all speakers from both sessions to share their audio and video again so we can all be on stage for the discussion. Nigel is the founding director of the Center for Cosmopolitan Studies at the University of St Andrews, an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, of the Learned Society of Wales, and of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of the Arts. He's also a founding fellow of the Institute of Gothenburg, Scotland, and he has authored and edited more books and papers that I could possibly start speaking about. So, Nigel, please, the stage is yours.
Thanks very much. Can you see me and hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks to Maya and Eleni, this panel has offered us 8 very interesting and distinct papers, even though only 7 of them were actually presented in person today. In my brief time as discussant, I'd like to outline certain directions of further travel that the papers have suggested. But first, I want to remind you of the 6 questions that the panel abstract raised. First, do people understand well-being in the same way in physically, socially, economically, and culturally different environments? Second question, how may we measure well-being? Also, how may we appreciate it as an ongoing process? Third question, Is well-being something that is individual, a subjective experience constructed through habitual embodied practices, or alternatively, is well-being made in relation to others through collective construction of a sense of belonging within a wider identity group? Question number 5. Are well-being and sickness, health and disease, life and death to be seen in binary terms, one or the other? And finally, is well-being attached fundamentally to a known routine, potentially threatened by the intervention of social, cultural, and natural events? Mention of routine reminds me of Virginia Woolf's observation that well-being is a feeling, and that this feeling is attached to the achieving of a purposeful, methodical rhythm. This was a conclusion that I could myself draw when studying how hospital orderlies in Scotland achieved a sense of wellness in their work identity by feeling that they were in charge of their working routines. This is how Virginia Woolf phrases it. Quote, "The mere process of life is satisfactory. Something always has to be done next. Tuesday follows Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday. Each spreads the same ripple of well-being, repeats the same curve of rhythm. And so identity becomes robust," unquote. So where does this lead? Where have the 6 questions in the abstract and the 7 or 8 papers in the panel, where have they led us? I'd like to suggest 6 likely directions of further travel. Number 1, it's significant how the papers in this session often enter the well-being debate excuse me, through instances of routine being disturbed. A storm and flood on Samathraki causing the loss of embodied relationships and new traumatized selves, according to Eleni. Also, the elderly residents of care homes whom COVID have robbed of company, according to Jamie. Also, the mental distress of service evaders in London for whom social ties have been exhausted and trust in others has broken down, according to Kira. So the first direction of travel has been how routine is disturbed and that this might lead to a loss of well-being. Second direction of likely travel concerns how well-being attaches to the topography of certain spaces. We heard from Manuela in an Amazonian Quilombo community where visiting certain places at specific times of the day potentially leads to particular forms of illness. And again, Eleni on flooded Samathraki. More broadly, there seems to be the challenge that urbanism per se poses for well-being. We might say that this occurred in papers by Maya, by Kira, and by Letizia, who wasn't able to present. Number 3, another common theme is how well-being may consciously attach to a form of care that sets itself up in opposition to a biomedical model, either by a rejection of medications, as in Kira's paper, or by a communal sharing and reuse of pharmaceutical medication that negates an individualized person-centered model, as in Letizia's paper, or by community involvement alongside the biomedical and technological interventions of medical professionals and experts, as we heard from Stefan. Fourth, there's a strong emphasis on well-being as a collective and communitarian phenomenon, and an explicit denying of discourses that emphasize individual responsibility. Here is Giorgio's account of the Wana of Sulawesi, where a sense of community is necessary for a meaningful life, even for waking up in the morning. Also, Eleni, again, also Letitia's network of social clinics of solidarity as alternative grassroots healthcare providers, and, in a way, Maya's account of Moroccan culture itself as being schizophrenic. Number 5, more specifically, the way that Giorgio describes illness and death as bringing together Wana community members in rituals which not only reaffirm the unity of the community, but also manifest an empowering of physical density of people. So well-being attaching to a physical density of people resonates with Manuela's account of rituals that reaffirm firmness. And here too is Kira's description of therapeutic healing involving being with others, openly, without rules, expectations, or regulations, and through listening. And also with Jamie and the physicality of care homes, and Eleni and collective lobby groups on Samothrace. Finally, as a direction of further travel, I'd like to draw attention to the emotional registers that the papers come to treat. I include here the schizophrenia, the feeling of confusion and fractured identity that Maya describes for young women in Morocco. Also the fear as affective process that Eleni finds Samothrace residents developing. Also the desire of so many contributors to address the perceived marginality of their research subjects. So here is Jamie's desire to avoid stereotypes of the elderly and consider their agency and their dignity. Here is Stefan's desire to see marginalized and excluded communities as active partners in healthcare initiatives. And also again, for Letizia and Kira, there is the emotional register of inclusivity, including those communities that might be marginalized. So what I've been most interested in are these 6 directions of potential overlapping travel among the contributions arising from the 6 questions in the panel abstract. I'm sure there's more again that could be said in the way of fruitful outcomes, but I shall stop there in terms of offering further suggestions and end with one question that I might pose to each of the speakers. I'd like to ask Manuela how her ideas on well-being changed after she herself became sick in the field, how that brought her own body into play, and how that bodily sense of personal sickness led to a different sense of the well-being and the life world of others. I'd like to ask Eleni whether she is deeming fear to be something positive and adaptive. She says that fear allows residents to develop an alert awareness and through that to reconcile with their surroundings. And how this sort of fear is positive and potentially adaptive might live alongside the trauma of being fearful of as insignificant things as running water. Maya, I'd like to ask Maya. Maya writes at one point that schizophrenia is a metaphor for experience of sickness. And I wonder whether she's using metaphor there in contradistinction to a feeling. Is when her informants talked about schizophrenia, were they being metaphoric or were they being literal? Can schizophrenia be something to feel good or at least neutral about? And I don't think Maya heard the question I was asking at the end of the last session, which was schizophrenia might be set against syncretism, might be opposed to something syncretic. And there's been a lot of either or in her presentation, either Frenchness, either modernity, or Moroccanness and Islam and traditionalness. Were there no instances of something more syncretic occurring? Giorgio, you're right that the community is more important than the individual, but you also say that a conflict between two people can escalate and bring sickness to the community. That would seem to me to suggest a very important role for individual behavior and agency. Individuals seem to play very important roles in the ongoing health of the community. So while community might have a value of greater importance than the individual, it doesn't have an ontological existence of greater significance than the individual. If individuals by their behavior can threaten community existence or health. Kira, I'd like to ask whether experimenting with therapeutic rituals and being alongside one another in a crisis and listening, especially in the way that you described the relative chaos of this coming together, I wondered whether it actually led to long-term health benefits, whether people actually said that they were better off than they were in the therapeutic regime of biomedicine. Jamie, I'd like to ask Jamie how dignity relates to well-being. Dignity was a term that, that figures quite prominently in the abstract. I'd like to ask you how dignity relates to well-being. Does it overlap well-being? Does it contradict well-being? Is it the same as well-being? How are you going to conceive of the dignity of your informants, even if they're not in a state of well-being or health? Letitia's question can go by the board, which just leads me to Stefan, whom I'd like to ask whether the recommendation of community involvement specifically is specifically for those who have suffered a history of structural exclusion and marginalization in public health, or would you recommend community involvement for those who are not structurally excluded or marginalized, for whom there might not necessarily be a sense of community belonging at all? I'm not sure what community I would sign up as belonging to, for example. And I'd be far happier to have medical experts telling me what's happening rather than my neighbors telling me what's happening in the middle of COVID, for example. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I'll put on my headphones now so I can hear anything. I also feel I need to release my cat from the attic because it's been scratching right the way through this presentation and meowing. So I'm just going to absent myself from the screen for 5 seconds. I'm back, the cat's safe.
Okay, we're having technical problems. So Eleni's microphone seems to not be working. So I will step in. Thank you so much, Nigel. That was really, really interesting. And yeah, I think that was really great to hear your perspective from kind of this overarching look at our panel and the papers. And that was really lovely. So I think if it's okay, let's order the papers discussed. So Manuela, would you like to tackle Nigel's question?
Okay, thank you for your interesting question. I must say that for me, it was this fieldwork experience was, in a certain sense, a destabilizing experience. Because it presented me with a very strong relationship between my body and the environment, between me and a non-human world. And this strong relational dimension made me often think about what it meant for me to be well, to stay. The meaning of the well-being, and in a certain sense, my personal experience of illness modify my idea of what well-being means. So yes, I could reply that yes is my the reply to the question is yes, absolutely.
Just really quickly, stemming off of that, do you find yourself outside of work connecting your body and how you feel environment and landscape around you? Like, has it moved outside of fieldwork at all?
I think that when I came back, it slowly, this sensation of relationship slowly disappeared. It was very slowly, but it was, in a certain sense, my dog wasn't here, so as my interlocutor says, so this sensation changed over the time.
Do you think that the fact that you were ill in this new environment, in the forest, was that part and parcel of what made the forest not only real, but a kind of person? I'm wondering whether your illness led you to anthropomorphize the forest in a way that you might not have so much if you were well.
Maybe yes. In a certain sense, they say that places have to know you, and when they know you better, you have less occasion to fall ill. And it happened. I don't know why, but I had a lot of fever in the first month, but at the end, after almost a year, I felt better. I don't know explain why. Doctor also did not understand very well what was happening, but it was my experience. It was so strange. It's very strange to explain.
Like to try again and see if we can hear you this time.
Can you hear me now? Is it
Yeah.
working?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank God. So thank you for the questions, Nigel, so much. Is fear positive and adaptive? It could be. I think my interpretation of it was along the lines of what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, which is a very contradictory topic, but it means that after trauma, people who necessarily wouldn't have the way or the experience to the personal capacity to overcome it, they find a way to do so and to change their life to a better direction. And I was thinking that this could happen if mental health and if changing the reasons this flood happened in the first place was happening alongside community lines. So if action was taken on behalf of the community, instead of having people stressing out on their own. So it could potentially be something good. It could be something that motivates people and that motivates the islanders on Samothraki to change their lives and to ask, to demand more attention, to demand more support from the state, and to actually use these extremely negative and impactful events to make a difference for the better. So, and this is not, of course, to say that fearing is good or that we want to cause fear to the people. Certainly not. But given that there was no way to change what had happened, and considering the impact it has had on people's emotional state, they had the option of making something out of it. And that was in terms of their own organization in the community, but also in terms of playing with the state and communicating their issues as a community as a whole, which would provide them with a better basis to ask for more and to bring attention to what they otherwise thought was a very neglected and very forgotten community by the state itself.
It fits in nicely with something that Manuela has just been saying about environmental alertness. You might paraphrase the fear with something more positive, like awareness, alertness, being more at one with their environment as a result of the trauma. And this leads them to a healthier and a healthier adaptation to the lived environment.
It makes me so happy that we made this ordered presentation. So yeah, I think it verifies our organization with Maya. Thank you. So we'll move on to the next speaker, who is Maya.
Yes, so Nigel, I'm going to answer your question the opposite way you asked it. So kind of end of your question, looking at this either or, and I'm sorry that I missed your note in the first panel. So looking at this either or, as you were saying, yeah, I think it really is a theme in both in this discussion and in some of my wider field work. And in case I didn't make it quite clear enough, I'm certainly not, that's not my belief that it's an either or, but it was the overarching kind of theme from my participants, this feeling of either modern or traditional, either more European or more, of course there are exceptions to that. I had one friend in the field, and she, I think, herself very much identified as who was this mixture of modern and traditional. This undercurrent in many interviews, this feeling of you really couldn't exist as a traditional Muslim while being a modern French Moroccan, which I found really interesting. People who absolutely did embody both of those concepts at the same time, and it was interesting to hear about feeling that those were things that they couldn't embody at the same time, and they kind of had to actively choose to go more traditionally and feel a bit more connected with their religion, or to feel a bit more connected to the French influences in Morocco. Yeah, in terms of my describing the schizophrenia that my informants discussed as metaphoric rather than a feeling, thank you for bringing that up. I didn't realize I was doing that. That's really interesting. And I'm gonna look at that, because I think you're absolutely right that it could be maybe more emotional than metaphoric. Yeah, thank you.
Or it could be more metaphoric than emotional. I mean, what you just described about either or suggests that what you're dealing with are discourses, and that these are opposed discourses. and or rather, the discourse is one of opposition, of either tradition or modernity, either Islam or Frenchness. And this is not a matter of experience or feeling, this is a matter of discourse, that the discourse only allows for one position or another and not something syncretic between them. And I would also suggest that, that there's a nice overlap between schizophrenia as being metaphoric, part of a discourse, that it's a way of speaking. It's a way of being in speech, in interaction, in conversation. And I mean, it might also be a feeling, but it needn't be a feeling. There can be a disconnect between discourse and feeling, or discourse and the emotion that you inhabit. So it'll be really interesting to follow up notions of schizophrenia as an aspect of discursivity, in the same way that tradition and modernity are.
Next up is Georgia.
Hi. Besides the fact that you quoted my work, I think you didn't know it, but was incredible for me. Yeah, I get your point, and it remembers me that in 1 year of fieldwork, I saw only once somebody upset. And when it happened, everybody there moved to fix the issue. It was a problem of everybody. It was like, no, it's not just his problem, it was everybody's problem. For me, it can be explained with a kind of analogy with the body. The community is the entire body. Of course, if you get sick in a finger, it's an issue. It's like if somebody, any member of the community is a part of the body, if you get sick and you don't treat the issue, you spread the sickness. So of course, it's very important that each member is going to be held like emotionally and physically, but it is good for the community. So it's always an issue of the community. But of course, each person is important, but as part of the community. I hope this answered to your question and your point. It was very interesting. Easy.
Yes, so that's a nice answer. I suppose in that sentence that I quoted, the key word is important.
Yeah,
where community is more important. And I was just drawing attention to the fact that that might register a value, or it might register an actuality, a fact of life. And individuals are important facts of life, in the same way that if the community is a body, if my body is a body, then it's important that my fingers work and that they're healthy, and everything else in the body that has an individual identity and nature works. So it's just a matter of framing the different ways that you can mean important in this context.
But like a small sample is that they told me that if somebody steals something, like you steal a banana, the entire community gives you banana, so you're not going to do it anymore. So there is this thing that if you have an issue, it's our issue.
Yeah, if you steal a banana, we're going to make you sick.
No, we are going to solve the issue. You're not going to need any more to steal. Yeah. Thank you. I think next one.
Please go ahead. Oh, you're still muted. No, you want to try to refresh, and maybe Jamie can answer in the meantime? Okay, great. So Jamie, if you're ready, can you please go ahead?
Hi. Thank you, Nigel. The relationship between dignity and well-being is an ongoing question in my own conceptualization of this project. But I think that a focus on experiences, both subjective and intersubjective, of dignity can help problematize and nuance ideas of well-being. So I do think they can be separate, they can be the same. I think interrelated might be the word. But I do think that a focus on dignity and what that might mean for members of this community could help move away from a focus on other performances of well-being, like agency, or some looking at well-being as the mere absence of illness. I think it can help sort of move into looking at the individual experience and what that might entail. It's kind of a simplistic answer to that.
I'd just like to say that there can be different kinds of phenomena. You know, I'd like to say that a human being is dignified, whatever their state of health, whether they're active or inactive, whether they're with others or by themselves. It's part of their nature. It's part of the ontology of being a living individual human being, is that you are dignified. And being healthy or sick, being active or inactive, being an agent or being passive, these are more situational or momentary aspects of being, whereas dignity is always there. Dignity always exists as long as life does. So I'd like to see them as different kinds of concept. That was all.
I think unless Jamie has anything else to add, Kira can try again to share her audio. Just to let you know very quickly, Nathan has very kindly told us we could go over time if we want to. But if we leave or refresh the session past 6 o'clock, then you won't be able to return to the session because it will literally not exist anymore. So we can stay in the session after 6 as long as we do not log out or refresh. Kira, you want to try again? Oh no, it's not working. But I heard you putting on your microphone before. Maybe you want to try without the microphone at all? No, it's not working.
It seemed to be working before.
Yeah, you want
when
to
you refreshed.
One last time, maybe. And maybe let's wait for her, because I think when she mutes herself, then she can no longer speak. Okay.
Hello?
Speak, yes.
Hey. I don't know about you guys, but I don't think I'm a fan of Hopin after this. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Yeah, so thank you for the question. So I think actually something that Jamie said really resonated with when I was trying to think of my response, which is that well-being is not, I don't see well-being as the opposite of illness or distress. And so I think when people ask me questions like, are people better off or more well in certain environments or spaces, I think I don't really enjoy answering those kinds of questions because I also don't feel like qualified to answer. But that's one kind of answer. But on the other hand, I would also say that, I mean, I do kind of say in my paper, I kind of make the point that, I mean, yeah, so different interlocutors have different experiences, but I think were people better off in chaotic environments than in biomedical spaces, and what did listening do, which other treatments didn't do? I think that was your question. I think that kind of the point I was trying to make is that hospital spaces and clinics, etc., in those spaces, interlocutors at least describe feeling a sort of lack of control, a lack of choice, a kind of restricted in their communication. And I think other people have called this kind of hermeneutic injustice, the sense that you can't express yourself with the language that's available in clinical terms. And that, I think, kind of what activists are kind of trying to do, I don't know in how kind of conscious or intentional, but there's this kind of idea that disorderly places invite more autonomy and are empowering and sort of enable moral repair and kind of this like idea of letting be. And also, I think also the point is that I wouldn't like to suggest that arguments and conflict are also always negative things. I think that they can sort of generate relatedness as well. I think that often quite often there's this idea that there's an idea that conflict is kind of a negative thing, and I'm not sure that I agree with that either. So I think it's complicated, but I think I would say that these spaces are kind of always in the process of becoming. I think that what people are trying to do is generate a different kind of space, which is more empowering and kind of I think I've answered your question.
I think letting be is a nice framing of it. I'd like to see how you develop the concept of letting be as a it reminds me of Iris Murdoch and her definition of goodness, which was basically letting be. Goodness is not imposing your values on someone else, but allowing other individuals to let be, or letting them be. So I'd like to see how you develop letting be as a version of goodness further. And what you were saying about being heard, the link between wellness and being heard resonates nicely with what Eleni was saying, where she felt that people on Samothrace were not being heard. And it leads in nicely into what Stefan is going to tell us about marginalized communities not being heard.
Yeah, thank you for that lead into me. And also thank you for that reference, the series of literary references interspersed through your comments. It makes this literary critic, scholar, student feel much more at home. So thank you very much. But to answer your sort of two-pronged question, I would say, I wouldn't just say we need to focus on or include vulnerable or otherwise marginalized communities, although the emphasis on my talk has been precisely those communities, in large part because COVID-19 is primarily impacting those communities in many respects. And so that's why I just focus there. However, the general discussion of community that I am kind of building out is really one that is born out of the literature and scholarship of scenario practitioners themselves, who acknowledge time and time again, we need to find a way to bridge the gap. And yet all of the narratives they tell between the public health experts and don't actually integrate that gap. So frequently outbreak scenarios will end with say, okay, we need to reach out to labor movements. We need to reach out to even professional organizations, but they never actually integrate those people into the process. And my focus on narrative was precisely to start thinking about why is it that even though they recognize the need to integrate community, they fail to do this time and time again. And so there are occasional notes. Okay, a decade ago there was a RAND Corporation series of public health outbreak scenarios that focused on outbreaks in poultry farms, but we need to integrate poultry farmers and poultry laborers into these scenarios, but they never actually got around to it. And so that's one kind of, hopefully some brief way to responding to that question. But I also think the thing that I didn't talk about is scenarios are designed to produce trust between diverse stakeholders in times where outside of crisis, like a preemptive response to crisis, And so it is precisely not so much to have your neighbors tell you what they think is happening, but precisely to have your neighbors trust the public health experts to talk to them in order to have those relationships in the moment of crisis. Because right now, I think we see some of the breakdown between let's say communities, your neighbors, and public health experts, where people are not responding, not actually communicating, because those lines of trust that were supposed to be established by these scenarios in advance were not actually created because no one was actually at the table.
Just to say that I've realized how your use of the term narrative, Stefan, overlaps nicely with Maya's, or what I take to be Maya's emphasis on discourse. That in both cases, we're seeing conventional ways in which something might be spoken about. And conventional ways of speaking might be a world away from the experience of those inhabiting those discourses or promoting those narratives. So thank you for that.
There doesn't seem to be any questions from the audience. But one thing that became very clear to me throughout the panels, so both sessions, is how when one gets sick, and we already knew that, we take our bodies for granted, but when we get sick, we realize the limitations of our physical bodies and the limitations of our existence in the world. And right now with the pandemic, we also see that we used to take issues of mental health and of physical health for granted. So I think what this panel has really well achieved is to show us that we can no longer take so many things for granted in our daily experience, and also that we really can go beyond what we expect it to be the ordinary, what we expect it to be the routine in terms of adapting. And yes, we're having a question by Dr. Claire Forster, so I'm going to read it out. So I was wondering, with reference to Stefan's talk, is there also a notion of locating blame for having seen it coming or not reacted accordingly? Are there any hesitancies to prepare, for example, via scenarios, because all involved will eventually be pointed at for being the ones who should have known better?
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, frequently in these sort of media and medical responses that I referenced very obliquely, where we should have known better, or we were warned, there is this associated notion of the government knew yet failed to act appropriately. So there is very much, okay, when there is a diagnosis of what actually went wrong, we will be able to locate what went wrong. In the warning from the expert came, oh, Claire has gone.
Stefan, still go ahead answering.
Yeah. So the experts knew what was to come, and yet the government failed to act on their proposals or policies. And so that is sort of built into that structure. My kind of concern with that structure is it precisely maintains authority exactly as it sees fit. It keeps a kind of very neat box around who has decision-making capability and who makes decisions on behalf of everyone else. So that's one thing. The other question, are there any hesitancies to prepare via scenarios because all involved would eventually be pointed out for being the ones who should have known better? This is a sort of tricky thing about scenarios that is sort of lost in the translation into these media responses and even my discussion. Scenario thinkers themselves are very clear that these are not predictions. They are merely a series of possibilities that kind of open up the horizon of the future. In many cases, the future is called, quote unquote, a possibility space. And so the plan here, the purpose, is to prepare for as many possible eventualities as possible, as feasible, rather than to prepare for one specific thing. And so even if something doesn't come to pass, there are scenario thinkers are, as it were, not to blame in the same way a forecast can be failed or a forecast can fail to come to fruition, if that makes sense.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Would anybody else like to make a comment or raise a point? Okay, we're almost 10 minutes past, so I think this is a great time to wrap up. Thank you all so much for your work and your effort in putting this panel together. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to Nigel for his thoughtful comments and for taking the time to engage with our papers. Thank you so much to our volunteer, Nathan, for being here throughout both sessions to save the day with all the tech issues. There is one DJ set starting at 6:30, so in 20 minutes, and it will be running for 90 minutes, and this is the end of the conference. So I will be certainly attending that, and I'm looking forward to seeing you there. Otherwise, stay in touch. Enjoy, for those in the UK, enjoy your Easter break.